Hi, my name is Carissa Laffey, and today I'm going to be showing you an activity that will utilize the beaches and dunes on the Bolivar Habitat Preserve. Sargassum Beach Walk is an activity that's designed for 6th through 8th grade and is best done during the summer months. For Sargassum Beach Walk, you will need Sargassum Seek and Find guides, 5-gallon buckets, and guided and independent practice worksheets. Sargassum Beach Walk is an activity that starts outside in the beaches and dunes collecting specimens and then ends in the classroom with data analysis.
In the summer, a lot of sargassum floats up on the beaches of the Texas coast. Two species of sargassum are of interest to Galveston visitors, Sargassum natans and Sargassum flutans. These sargassum species are pelagic brown algae, more commonly referred to as seaweed or gulf weeds. While many sargassum species are benthic, the species we find in the Gulf of Mexico are free-floating and never attached to the ocean floor. The sargassum species reproduce asexually by fragmentation from the parent organism rather than by seed or spore, making them float like one big superorganism. Sargassum also has air bladders that allow them to float on or near the surface of the water to gather sunlight for photosynthesis. Free-floating sargassum is found only in the Atlantic Ocean, where algae grow in the calm waters of the tropical and subtropical areas like the Sargasso Sea. The Sargasso Sea is almost 2/3 the size of the United States and is a free-floating meadow of sargassum lying between the United States and Africa. The sargassum consolidates in large floating mats that can span over 100 meters. Ocean currents and winds carry these mats to coastlines along the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, where they are deposited on beaches at the high tide line. Sargassum travels to the Texas coast through what researchers at Texas A&M University at Galveston describe as the Sargassum Loop system. The loop originates in the Sargasso Sea, and currents carry the floating mats through the Caribbean Sea, north past the Yucatan Peninsula and around the Gulf of Mexico than anywhere else in the world. And during the time in the warm waters of the Gulf, the sargassum tends to grow quickly. The exact reason of the influx of sargassum to Texas beaches varies each year and is still being researched. Different factors that affect the amount of sargassum include weather patterns impacting ocean currents and the amount of time sargassum spends in nutrient-rich waters. For example, due to the unusually cold winter in 2014 and the numerous cold fronts that moved into the Gulf that year, the sargassum was pushed into the Bay of Campeche. The Bay of Campeche is a very nutrient-rich part of the Gulf of Mexico, and the prolonged stay allowed the sargassum to grow longer and increase in size. The floating mats of sargassum provide important functions for pelagic species. The floating mats are essential habitats for many species of fish, shrimp, crabs, and other invertebrates and microorganisms. 10 species are actually endemic to the floating mat and found nowhere else in the world. The mats serve as a resource for migratory species such as humpback whales out in the vast openness of the ocean, and are even a food resource for larger commercial species such as tuna and other predators that lurk around the edges of the sargassum community. 4 species of sea turtles even use the sargassum. The endangered loggerhead and the green sea turtle are critically endangered. Hawksbill and Kemp's Ridley, which is the Texas state turtle, are also endangered. After hatching in the frenzy of making it to the water, young sea turtles use floating mats as rafts and means of shelter and sustenance for survival in the ocean. Organisms that reside in the sargassum or use it for transport often possess physical adaptations that allow them to blend into the floating mats and camouflage them from potential predators. The sargassum shrimp is perfectly colored to blend into the algae's leaf-like blades, and the sargassum sea slug is also well camouflaged, and it looks like an extension of the algae. The sargassum frogfish also blends in well with the floating mats, and the shape of its fins enable the predator to easily creep up on unsuspecting prey. Although historically the answer to sargassum landings has been to rake it for removal or return to the ocean, sargassum also provides many benefits on our beaches. Sargassum traps sand within its strands as it accumulates. It can facilitate dune buildup, which is an important defense against beach erosion and damage from tropical storms. As sargassum decomposes, it serves as fertilizer for dune plants, which stabilize the dune systems. Even the decomposing organism washed ashore with the sargassum serve as an important food source for seabirds and shorebirds. The accompanying smell is one of the main reasons visitors find seasonal sargassum landings unsightly. The sargassum itself does not smell, but rather the process of decomposition occurring on the beach gives off a foul odor. Not only is the sargassum decomposing, but so is a multitude of marine life that's found within the floating mats and washed ashore in the sargassum. Despite the smell, this decomposition actually hints at several important benefits provided by the floating algae. Take your students to the beach and wade into the water with 5-gallon buckets. Find floating clumps of sargassum and shake the seaweed over your bucket, and animals will fall out. Keep several inches of seawater in your bucket and repeat this several times. If your students are allowed to wade into the water, break them up into teams of 4, each armed with a bucket. You will increase your chances of catching a wider variety of organisms if more of you are searching for them. Look into the bucket and see what has been caught. Notice how every animal is camouflaged to be the same coloration of the sargassum. In the bucket, you will find crabs, shrimp, nudibranchs, fish, seahorses, and pipefish. These animals are all specifically adapted to living their entire life in the sargassum. Most of the animals will be very small and can be easily passed around and shared with each other. Additionally, you cannot really kill these because eventually the organisms would wash ashore with the seaweed and become food for gulls, terns, and shorebirds. See how many different species you can catch in one location and record your findings below in the column labeled Habitat 1. Use the Sargassum Seek and Find guide in your supply kit from Artist Boat to identify the species you catch. After you have practiced as a class, divide your students into groups and allow them to spread out to different locations along the beach to collect data for Habitat 2. Feel free to encourage a little friendly competition as well as a collaborative effort. Complete the following guided practice exercises with your class. Demonstrate how to calculate species diversity using the first sample data set. Complete the second set of calculations together or in student groups. In ecology, Simpson's index is used to quantify the biodiversity of a habitat. A habitat is the natural environment of a plant, animal, or other organism. Biodiversity is the variety of life in a particular habitat. Biodiversity takes into account the number of species and the relative abundance of each species. Species richness is the number of different species represented in a particular habitat. Species evenness is the abundance of each species represented in a habitat. When calculating biodiversity, Simpson's index accounts for both species richness and species evenness in order to determine the overall biodiversity of a given habitat. The formula for Simpson's index of diversity is shown on the screen. To interpret the results, the capital D represents the probability of randomly sampling two different species in a given habitat. For example, if capital D equals 0.75, then there is a 75% chance selecting two different species and a 25% chance of selecting two of the same species.
With this beach walk activity, your students are going to learn about ocean currents and also the weather patterns that will affect the movement of materials around the ocean, such as sargassum. Your students are also going to learn about biodiversity. Have your students bring field guides or dichotomous keys with them so that they can identify the different types of species that they see, whether it's a bird or something living within the sargassum, like a fish or a crab or other inverts. Sometimes it can be challenging to identify some of the different species that you may find. In that case, you can download the free app called iNaturalist. With iNaturalist, all you have to do is take a picture of the specimen that you can't identify, and you will be provided with suggestions on what that species may be. You can easily adapt this activity to younger students. Instead of identifying what the biodiversity is, just focus on tallying the number of different specimens that you found for each species. Close this activity by discussing some of the more exciting specimens that your students have found. You can even lead a discussion on biodiversity by posing the question, how do all of these species inhabit the same space? You can expand this activity by using quadrats and transects to sample the different species that are within the environment. A quadrat is a frame that will isolate specific parts of that ecosystem, and a transect is a line that's placed over a community of organisms. You can also collect specimens by conducting net sweeping. With net sweeping, you can have your students walk through the water about 10 to 15 paces and swing a net in front of their feet that will make a 180-degree arc. After doing that, they can dump any of the specimens or sargassum that they collected into a bucket and then begin recording the different species that they found. You can also create graphs after you find the biodiversity of the organisms. Discuss with your students what would be the best way to convey this data to the public. Are there specific pictures, graphics, or colors that they can use to make their data more palatable to the public?